Mike Bearpark and Andrew Ostler, also known as Oz from Darkroom. They're playing the Y2K 15 Loop Fest in Santa Cruz, and we're here to do an in-depth interview with these folks. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Well, you and Oz both have a long-term friendship and musical relationship. Why don't you talk about your early projects and how they led to the formation of Darkroom?
So I actually met Oz in connection with another project that I'm involved in now. Oz was the sound engineer for a gig that the band No Man with Tim Bonus and Stephen Wilson played in Cambridge. I got talking to him afterwards, discovered he did some music that involved synthesizers. This sounded interesting to me, so I said, just bring me a tape and see what we can do.
Yeah, we bonded over a Alesis Quadriverb, which we both owned and were very fond of.
So there's, it's partly a technical fascination, but also shared interest in particular musics. And when we started working together as a trio, Love X and Y, the band that Oz was in was a duo, I joined as a guitarist, and I think we instantly clicked and managed to produce songs which had an experimental edge where I could feature different styles of guitar than I would get to play in other bands. And so overall, very exciting. And we're still in touch since, so obviously we clicked somehow. But since we've had the chance to explore different areas of synthesizer technology, in looping, which is what brings us here to the festival.
Yeah, the thing that more closely resembles Darkroom as it is now came from an opportunity Mike had to do a live soundtrack at was it Nevers Film Festival
in
in
France.
97. So Mike and I prepared a backing tape for that, which was basically half an hour of twiddling the knobs on a Pro 1 through some big delays. And the rest is history, really.
The idea is we take the backing track, perform over it, record our performance, and then merge all these things together, and all of this was done on 8-track cassette, and that essentially became the first Darkroom album. Yeah, it had a certain feel that in some ways we've occasionally gone back to with the modern technology, but it was the feel of it more than the technology that was important.
Mm. Well, how would you describe Darkroom's mission?
I expect we'll answer that differently. My mission in music is never been anything other than the pursuit of beauty, which sounds kind of pretentious, but I have no more pretentious way of saying it than that's what I always want to try and do for my own edification, if no one else's.
I think it would be fair to say that your definition of beauty sometimes stretches other people's definition of beauty.
That's true. That is true.
Which is the wonderful thing that makes the collaboration work. And certainly I have a lot of respect for your definition of beauty, particularly when that's a kind of wall of synthesizer noise that's been chopped up and fed through a load of processing, the voice on top. I suppose for me, it's the interaction between technology and people, and again, making something that I'd love to hear over and over again, making something that means something to me and that will last after I've finished with it and have some value. But what I perceive to have some value anyway. But it's definitely the interaction, people, technology, the ability to improvise, exploring different sonic spaces, challenging myself, discovering new things. These are all part of what Darkroom does.
Well, tell me about the roles each of you play in this duo.
The pithy answer is always guitar and everything else, but
well,
that's probably a bit limiting for both of us. Mike, what do you consider you do?
So in terms of the performance that we're going to do today, which is probably representative of the starting point for pretty much any Darkroom recording, I'm the guitarist. I feed my guitar through a varying number of processing devices, and Oz will get access to that signal, which he can then choose to loop. So one of the things that makes us distinctive, for example, in this environment is I don't do any of my own looping. I feed that signal to Oz. He can process it. He can choose to do what he wants with it, and often he'll present me back with a much more beautiful version of what I played, but a selected version, one that I'm not expecting to interact with. So one of the things I think I provide, as well as a basic sound source, is also the human feel that goes into the Darkroom machine.
Yeah, that's fair.
And Oz, I think, is the Darkroom machine.
Yeah, so I mean, on a kind of prosaic technical level, what I tend to work with, what I've been working with for a while, is a laptop set up with a bunch of software, but I'm always taking a feed from Mike. Our goal for a long time has been improvisation and no prepared sound, so anything that comes into the mix is played either by Mike or in the last, I don't know, 5 years I've been getting more and more into having a modular synthesizer with me, so that's another source of sound. And then more recently than that still, I've rediscovered a love of all woodwind. So various wind instruments have been making their way into Darkroom over the recent years too, all adding to the kind of things that can be looped.
Range of colour and exploration. So, and that's what the live performance would be. But in terms of, say, an album like Gravity's Dirty Work, which came out 2 years ago, that would be the starting point for a piece that may then get completely torn apart, reconstructed within the editing environment that Ableton Live produces. Now, maybe even a couple of phrases would end up being the starting point for something new, and then built over using the same process. Let me improvise over that. We've had other musicians like double basses, drums, trumpet, improvise over that, and assemble, almost like stop motion animation, the final piece that we want to hear. So some of Darkroom's music is essentially live. Some of the recordings that are on Bandcamp are done that way. Others have been through almost the kind of sonic processing that you might expect Trevor Horn to indulge in, that kind of level of attention to detail and love of sound.
Now, you've described your approach as guitar but not guitar, synthesizers but not keyboards. Elaborate on that.
So guitar but not the guitar means often when I'm playing, I'm trying to recapture the feeling of excitement of when I first heard a guitar and didn't really have any prejudices about what it was going to sound like. It's particularly the sound that has always attracted me about the guitar from when I first heard my brother play electric guitar. So I want to recapture that feeling. In some ways, I'm very much a DIY player, even though I've picked up things from jazz musicians and people are obviously a lot more studied. I still feel like I'm very much a novice on the guitar, and it's the sound that drives me to do whatever I do, whether it's playing something that's very, very sophisticated in a time signature, or just bashing out the same chord over and over again through a massive echo, because that's what the piece demands. It's the love of sound. So guitar, but not the kind of studied guitar that lots of people aspire to.
Yeah, and synthesizers but not keyboards. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, really. When you see that I play with a modular, it's I forget who once said the worst thing that happened to a synthesizer is that somebody stuck a keyboard on it. That's not what I'm not trying to provide a sound of somebody playing, synthesizing an oboe or whatever on a keyboard. It's the raw potential of electronic sound generation. Without actually having to physically play it in a traditional sense. It's all very much, it's either kind of playing itself to some degree with some degree of randomness or predictability, or it's being sequenced from, in my case, the computer usually. But it's all that lovely old sequence sound I'm particularly inspired by. Mm-hmm. Or wall of noise from the modular, as a lot of other
mad science, essentially.
Mad science, that's right.
Now, Mike, you once said taking creative chances while applying limitations is the best way to avoid the temptation to go for the obvious.
Yep.
How does that apply to Darkroom?
Well, in terms of the set we're going to play today, I've flown with a guitar. I've flown with the one guitar I'm happy to unbolt the neck off and stick it in a suitcase. It can be quite difficult to play. That makes me more conscious about my choice of notes, and also the range of sounds that I can get out of the instrument. Similarly, compared to most other artists who are featured on the bill, my pedal board is tiny, and I want to exploit the maximum amount I can from the very limited set of devices that I've got. So rather than having 20 things which I can switch in, some of which I might never use, I'm going to explore the full range of the 5 or 6 things that are down there. This partly comes from, I remember reading a quote by poet Philip Larkin once about how he thought for any kind of creative activity you needed a tension between the person doing it and their materials, and a tension between the person doing it and their audience. In some ways, the software that we have access to now, to really discover its limitations, they're vast. It's like exploring the whole solar system. There's far too much there to tweak with. So part of what I'm doing is reducing the number of variables so I can get them in my head and do something with them in real time. Yeah,
I mean that was very much Mike's mission statement. But I guess my approach to manage complexity is the no prepared sounds thing. If we start with a blank slate and the only thing we can do is what we play then and there, that it gets you going usually, unless unless Mike has a block and can't even play E, and then
Which hasn't ever happened yet.
nearly.
Well, tell me about the creation of The Rest of Noise, your recent 4-hour opus. How did that come together?
Surprisingly quickly compared to the previous shorter opus.
So over the last year in London, we've run a concert series called Tuesday's Post with looping vocalist Georgina Brett. It's really Georgina's night, but Oz and I got involved to help out, and it was a chance for Darkroom to play, and also for us to discover other artists who kind of existed on the board of what we might call live progressive ambient. That was the tagline of Tuesday's Post, something that was melodic, even if it was experimental. And given that opportunity, we had a monthly residency. We got to record every time we prepare something, a sketch for something slightly different. Everything gets recorded on Oz's laptop. We quickly realised that what was coming back from these concerts was consistently something that we wanted to hear again. We put initial rough mixes up on SoundCloud, and my feeling was SoundCloud is the place for experiment, for people to comment on work in progress. But I was playing some of these things over and over again, and it seemed like they were fitting together in a pattern. So I just said one day, why don't we collect them together as something that I would perceive to have more value? So rather than just dates and times, we'd give the tracks titles that in some way reflected what I heard in the piece. We got a photographer from Brazil who I met online to produce some lovely black and white photography. So each track had a certain image with it fitted under an umbrella. And I suppose each piece itself had varying amounts of attention to detail. We didn't feel like we had to keep the original recording and be faithful to that. In the great tradition of live albums, we could say not just remove clicks and pops that I didn't want to hear again, but maybe remove a section that would focus a piece, or even in one case just punching out a guitar line because I wish I hadn't played it. And what you have then is this kind of ghostly echo of what I played without the original piece that to me sounds far more interesting as a recording, which is the goal for making something that I'd be happy to release.
Yeah, that's it, really. Except that the follow-up to that is that we've got at least as much again to get through now, so watch out for the sequel.
I suppose the idea of calling it an album that was 3 3/4 hours long, that was a kind of conceptual gag that appealed to me. But apparently now, 3 3/4 hours long is nothing. I mean, Max Richter produced this piece recently that was performed on the BBC Radio 3, which is 8 hours long. This is Sleep. And other people are exploring this, and it seems like almost a paradox that we think of people's attention spans getting smaller and smaller, yet in some ways these big epic pieces of artwork take on a significance and a value, and that was something I wanted to explore. I promise I have played the album through all in one sitting just to check it flows, and I was happy that it did, so hence we're happy to release it.
You mentioned the weekly events you hold in London. So, the fact is that Darkroom isn't just about its own music, but it's also about helping to foster a creative music community. So talk to me about the events and opportunities that Darkroom helps create for others as well.
So Tuesday's Post tonight was Georgina's originally, and I suppose what we were helping to do initially was just take some of the weight of the organisation off her, but also it became something of our joint opportunity to curate and find interesting artists who perhaps didn't fit into many of the other nights. So there are plenty of nights of experimental music in London and I'm sure major cities across the globe. But what we discover going to these sometimes is that the experimentation is key. Things like melody or playing something you want to hear again, performance weren't necessarily key. And I suppose the Tuesday's Post brief, as we cooked it up, was there had to be some aspect of performance. So someone checking their email on their laptop wasn't really going to work. There had to be some aspect of melody, even if it was produced by the most crazy distortion or lo-fi piece of kit at all. There had to be
tonality, if not melody.
Okay.
So yeah.
And the progressive bit comes from a feature that Sid Smith wrote for Prog magazine in the UK, where we were featured alongside Baraji and the gods of Ambient. And we're very fortunate to have been included in that company. And it seemed to us that there has been this kind of connection in the background between progressive music and ambient, and people who explore those kind of textures. I perhaps wouldn't go as far to say as ambient was cooked up by prog musicians on their day off, but there's perhaps an aspect of that it's a parallel universe where the it's the sound that takes precedence over some other aspects that for some people define progressive rock.
Now, Darkroom has had many different incarnations. You've had incarnations that integrate vocals and song forms
Absolutely.
into the work.
Yeah.
How do those collaborations differ in terms of your creative process versus the more ambient, long-form instrumental stuff?
I wonder whether the answer is that they don't. When we were so the first Darkroom album had Tim Bonus, who's the singer I've worked with for an awful long time now. Tim was the vocalist. He was very much involved in the creation of some of the tracks. As I remember, he would have strong opinions about how we should do certain edits, and was also keen that some of the things we did were actually songs, even if they were probably at the more experimental end of what he was prepared to do at the time. And the follow-up, the album See Through, was essentially our songs album.
Yeah.
Many of the things were crafted with Tim in Oz's studio, putting things together and doing jams, and him singing over that and structuring it as a trio. But for various reasons, Tim decided that his focus was elsewhere. And in improvisation, say in the Tuesday's Post performances, we'd be very happy to have, say, Georgina, who's our other sponsor of the night, singing and taking us in a different direction. That's probably the reason why one of the follow-ups to The Rest Is Noise will essentially be a collaborations album. We've had Simon Taylor, who's the trumpet player on Gravity's Dirty Work, guested for a night, and pushed him. In some ways, his take on harmony pushed me away from my kind of folky modal default, which was exciting to be working against. The fact that he pushes me in that direction meant that we came out something that I certainly couldn't have done if it was just the two of us.
Yeah.
But yet it still very much reflects that spirit. I think he was integrated into that. He really got the idea.
Yeah. And then we've played with Andrew Booker, the drummer as well, who we played with, or Mike's played with more recently, but the three of us played semi-regularly for quite a number of months, if not years. Is Andrew's Improvisation project, which was another regular improvising night, which started as Andy plus anybody, but kind of settled down eventually to me, Mike, and Andy plus
a bass player. So it almost became a house band. Improvisation actually got a revival this year when we were playing some concerts, touring Tim's new solo album. I discovered that Improvisation was the support, and it had become a band. It even had a dressing room on one night, and that Improvisation became Andrew Booker drums, myself on guitar, and Colin Edwin on bass. And we've got a couple of recordings from that. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen to it, but it was very exciting to introduce Colin, who's an exceptionally gifted improviser and bassist, into something that resembled a particular kind of outfit that we'd worked in before. He really got it. It was very, very exciting to play. A couple of people who saw it, particularly at the London concert that did, said they were actually shocked to see in that context, which you might think of as progressive musical, and I wouldn't necessarily call it that, in that context to see that level of improvisation and see us stop dead, all as a trio, just naturally.
And one other thing Darkroom does is soundtrack music, so music with a specific intentionality about it. How does that differ from music you create for yourself?
We've rarely done something where someone's asked us to compose for a soundtrack. What tends to happen is that people have found us through SoundCloud or YouTube. They're looking for a particular feeling, and then what we'd do is they would give us some idea of a brief. We might take pieces that exist and edit with some kind of feel they have in mind, or even perhaps remix and tweak. Yeah. Adapt based on what they've said. And the Chris Marsh film, Rhombus, I think, was pretty much that.
Well, no, that was the exception to that, because that was where we knew ahead of time that he needed something and he had a rough brief. So we had a gig that week, so we went out to the gig with the express intention of making part of our set improvising the soundtrack that he needed, but as part of our gig. And that turned out very differently to what we would normally have played, because we were, trying to create the feeling of sort of unnerving spookiness that he wanted, rather than our normal sort of ambient wash.
But that I suppose have been the kind of lots of the Darkroom Tuesday's Post performances would have had some kind of sketch, even like a shape that it will start with an initial instrumentation will build up, come down, and then drift off into certain keys, which for a wind instrument player is something that you particularly have to worry about, and I guess I just follow whatever happens. It pushed us in a slightly different direction. So the sketch would have been something much more abstract than we would typically do. And so that doesn't feature on The Rest Is Noise, does it? I don't think that is only available as part of the film soundtrack.
Yes, that's true.
Got it.
So, Mike, you're also known for your work with No Man and Tim Bonus, as you mentioned. Tell me about your role and contributions to those projects.
So in No Man, when No Man... It was a surprise for lots of people that No Man started doing concerts again, even for some of the band. And so I was brought in as both the guitarist, but also someone who had helped work up the initial arrangements, because they were developed by the five of us, who were essentially the band that did some concerts for Tim Bonus's first solo album. And what was expected to happen is that we would work up these arrangements with Tim, some of which were done in my basement at home, and then we'd book a rehearsal studio, finesse these, and then Stephen would come in for the last 3 or 4 days and then take what we had, and we would all collectively assemble it together into the final set. So I suppose my role was the one guitar initially, planning that there would always be two, but also defining some of the arrangements, because some of the No Man material that we particularly wanted to play hadn't ever been performed live. The original albums, there was a tradition that they had gone out and performed it, and even if the recordings were different, there was some kind of interaction there, whereas tracks off Together We're Stranger, they'd pretty much never ever been performed live. So we were having to come up with arrangements or ideas how to translate this. And in some ways that had always been the block for No Man performing live. How would we translate this, given all the possible options? Do you take out a 10-piece band with woodwind and percussion? And I think we quickly decided that was impractical. Having the kernel of a working band, though, meant that we could build up ideas around it, and that's evolved since. So we replaced the electronic drums, which Tim used to use with his solo band, with Andy's acoustic drums, and developed the dynamics and power, which I suppose is one of the key aspects that came from doing that. We might take some recordings that are very, very atmospheric, but then build them up from a whisper to a scream on stage as a performance, and I think that's something that we do quite distinctively. But also as a guitarist, I'm very much conscious in No Man that it's meant to be a pair, so we have to have contrast. And I have a lot of respect for other guitarists who, when they work as a pair, are very conscious of the fact they need to leave a certain amount of space or have different approaches, and also have the courage to do something that's very, very simple, rather than overplaying and filling up all the space. Because ultimately, most people who are coming to see that project are excited about the songs, and some of the people involved. They want to come away with a fabulous experience, and I don't think they want to hear someone show off on guitar.
Now, you've known Steven Wilson for almost a quarter century. What's it like to work with him?
Exciting, occasionally intimidating. He's got incredibly high standards, and one of the things I discovered, of course, given that most of my background is in experimental music of one kind or another, is if I take out the same setup that I'm used to doing experimental gigs with and attempt to take it on tour with the band and with Stephen, then it just breaks. And he has little patience for that now, given he's used to a much, much higher standard. But he was also very generous with his advice. One of the things I particularly respect about what he does in terms of assembling the shows was that as soon as the songs were workable and fitted into some kind of set order, we would be rehearsing through the whole set. It wasn't interesting working on a particular piece. It was all in context. What does this song sound like in context? Don't worry too much about that section. We come back to that. What does it sound like in context? What's the overall flow? Very, very much like an album. He's an exceptional guitarist. He plays incredibly loud, as anyone who's been to see one of his shows will appreciate, particularly if they're in the first row or two. But he's all about the overall picture, whether it's the overall picture of an album or a set or a performance. I know he'll describe himself as not particularly a guitarist, which I think is disingenuous in the extreme, but he is focused on what everybody else is doing and has the whole picture in his head, which is frightening, actually, that he can put all that stuff in there.
Now, Oz, you run Expert Sleepers in parallel with your Darkroom work. Tell me about the software and plugins you create and how it informs your Darkroom output.
Okay, so Expert Sleepers is my business. I started off doing audio plugins. One of my first products was a big delay plugin, which rapidly turned out into a kind of a looping thing, which is still available, and I use a lot of in Darkroom. Since I started getting into the modular synth stuff for my own personal benefit, that then translated into my Expert Sleepers work as well. First of all, doing a plugin called Silent Way, and you'll have no trouble guessing where the name came from, which was a plugin for controlling analog stuff from a computer audio environment. Having done that software, that informed a need for certain bits of hardware that would make that easier and better. So I found myself building hardware, which was a total surprise. And since then, that's really taken off and it's really completely eclipsed the software side of what I do. I'm really lucky to have hit it exactly at the time when the modular synth market is hit such a boom, which is very exciting. So how that relates into Darkroom, I use my looping plugins for big delays and looping like you'd expect. I use all my modular stuff is driven from the computer using my own software and hardware, which is a particular point of pride actually, that I'm not just some guy in a lab. I actually take my own stuff out and gig with it and eat my own dog food, I believe is the expression. So yeah, excited to be doing that, and excited to be meeting all these other modular guys as well.
So career-wise, Darkroom is interesting in that you started with a record deal.
Yes.
Your first two albums came out on a label, and you progressed to working further and further in the independent realm. Talk to me about where that started, where you are now with how you release your albums, and what the rewards and challenges are of each scenario.
No Man were releasing albums on a label called Third Stone. Tim negotiated with them that they would release the Darkroom project, which he was also involved in. But apparently they're still selling the albums, but we've never seen any money from it, and we don't have the rights to the material. And both of those, from our point of view, are very, very negative, although it's not having the rights to the material, which is at this stage, I think, is the bigger negative. And we'd explored a number of different models. Where we've evolved now is that SoundCloud is the home for work in progress, that we invite people to comment on and say what they think, and if we want to put up short demos or mixes in progress, that's where we do it. But essentially our home on the web is Bandcamp now, because Bandcamp have a model where we can charge nothing if we want, pay as you want, or we can sell vinyl and physical product. And I suppose our three-pronged strategy, of which Bandcamp is the centre, is physical releases go through burningshed.com, the label that Tim Bonus and Pete Morgan set up with Peter Chilvers originally.
Yeah.
Burning Shed is the shop for physical releases, but we also sell them. And iTunes is something that we use to make available, just so we're in the channel, in a way. We're available in that, in case that's the place that someone is looking for our music.
Yeah, or in fact, we're pretty much everywhere you'd expect. Amazon physical sales as well. If we just don't want somebody not to buy it because the place they normally get their music doesn't have it, so we do sell through Amazon. We sell through Amazon MP3, all the streaming services, download services and whatnot, but the one that actually gives us an amount of money that is worth knowing is Bandcamp so far.
It's the central hosting environment, and we appreciate that they're trying to do something for the independent artist. So it would have been Oz's choice originally. I wouldn't have done the serious research, but we've been very happy with the way they work, the service that they provide, that they're innovating constantly, all of those things, and that what people are able to obtain from there is a high quality product.
What about the challenges that you face in trying to market, promote, and sell your music in this climate?
There is so much, and at that level there's so much potentially to discover. I suppose one of the things that we have that others aren't so fortunate to have is we have a back catalogue and a history. There's some kind of story behind what we do, and we're not the kind of people who will bombard someone like you, Anil, with a link to a Dropbox and say, "Hey, check this out." We're not going to do that. It's about having a story, having something that we truly value, and getting feedback from even individual listeners or people who discover that music, and building things up very, very slowly. So we don't have the budget to mass influence or attempt to mass influence people. I think what we have is something of lasting value, and the attempts that we do make to get that heard are entirely based on that if someone discovers it and values it, they might tell someone else that they know, and that chain will sort of gradually spread out.
There's a lot of artists in this space that you're in.
Yes.
Putting out a lot of music constantly. What's your perspective on what this sort of music needs to have to be differentiated and to be relevant in such a crowded universe?
One of the things we've certainly tried to do with Darkroom, even if we're releasing a collection of live material, is be really sure that we would want to hear it over and over again. That's the first thing. And also make sure that there's enough in there that you'll discover something new on repeated listening. In other words, it has some lasting value. I know I've probably used that phrase several times now, so let's say it again. The music that we release in some form via Bandcamp or as a physical release, it's something that we think of as having lasting value, so that even if it ends up in the bargain bin in Amoeba, I'll still be happy that it was worth putting out there. And if someone discovers it and they're open to the music, and this happens regularly, someone is genuinely shocked, I think, that it is that meaningful to them. Instrumental music that can have a kind of emotional impact, and be something that they treasure.
Yeah, I think we alluded to it earlier as well. I think that one of our differentiators is the fact that we're not just an electronic act with a bunch of synthesizers. Because Mike is fundamentally a guitarist playing guitar, even if that's a mangled, processed guitar, it lends the albums the sound of having been played rather than been programmed.
And we're very conscious to think about, say, the structuring of an album. Even if it's an album that's 3 3/4 long, there's a flow to it. So there's definitely what is the opening piece, and notionally there's also a join in the middle where you might imagine flipping over this kind of 3 feet wide final disc that you've played all this stuff. And that's definitely been something that's informed our other releases. Even as a CD, we would structure something, say, as a double album. There's side A, side B, C and D. There's a pacing that goes through it, and that I think, for someone who's prepared to listen to whole albums, which I think there are still people who do that, they'll get something extra and hopefully give it some kind of added value.
All right, well, let's wrap up with what's next for Darkroom.
So having released the Rest Is Noise, very, very much on our radar is the next part of that, which will almost certainly be the contrasting music that involves the collaborations from the Tuesday's Post Night. The other thing that we're very excited to be involved with is a project involving the Wellcome Collection, the research institute based on the Wellcome Foundation in London. We get to explore ambient music in a clinical setting. Does it help people who are recovering from trauma or injuries? And this has led to all sorts of events, like doing an installation at Wellcome where we were essentially a gallery feature that people would walk past. We got to do something we love, which is play for 4 hours as people transited past and really have the opportunity to explore different ideas. And half of the material that was recorded is something that I definitely want to hear again. So we make that available in some form. But it's leading to collaborations with the group that are involved in the project at Wellcome itself, be they neuroscientists or social scientists or psychologists. So I know other people have attempted to define what ambient music is, and if you do research via Google, you can find all sorts of different things. But it's for me, it's interesting that this group, as part of what they're studying, which is the effect of rest on the brain and why it's important and why slacking can be a good thing and how it leads to creativity and all these different topics, they actually want to see what the neuroscience is. What does it do to someone's brain? What's actually going on when you stress yourself too much and whether you allow yourself to have a creative space? And that might have all sorts of impacts, say, for public policy and all sorts of very non-rock and roll stuff.
All right, well, listen, thanks for your time, gentlemen.
Thanks very much for listening.